Okay, so first off, apologies for not uploading anything in a while. I did upload something about a week or so ago as of the time of this recording, but there was a big gap before that video. I originally intended for this video to come out a month ago, but if I had done that, it would have just been a cut and paste from my Twitch stream where I talked about the Sealed League and answered some questions at the end of December. I felt like I could do a video that was a little more put together for YouTube than just simply uploading what would basically be a Twitch highlight. That said, nearly all the footage in this video is from that Twitch stream in December, since it fits best with what I'm going to talk about today. And despite the lateness of this video, with this chapter of Sealed being done at this point, I still think it'll be of some use to Sealed players going forward. So, what am I talking about today? Well, if anyone didn't see the title of the video, I'll be talking about what I've learned playing Sealed League. I've been playing Sealed since the beginning, but I want to focus on what it's been like for me the past 4 months or so. Before I go any further, you might ask, Mulligan, why do you want to talk about Sealed League? What makes you qualified to talk about the Sealed League? So, some credentials, quote unquote, if you will. Since October of last year, I've been finishing in the top 200 of Sealed League. In December, I finished rank 18, peaking at rank 4 at one point during the league. Despite all this, I am not claiming to have any secret tech or top tips about how to consistently finish at a high ranking in Sealed, unfortunately. I'm just simply sharing what's been working for me since October, and I'm sure there are other things that other top Sealed players have done to be successful that are different from what I've been doing. If you've been successful in Sealed, feel free to share what's been working for you in the comments below. So the first thing I want to talk about is focusing on what I'm calling bread and butter. And I guess this is similar to the bread theory that's used in draft, but with some slight differences. The bread theory, for those new, is an acronym that stands for bombs, removal, evasion, aggro, and the D stands for duds or dregs, which stems from Magic the Gathering. You still want to play any bombs that you have. So these are cards that are your win condition. This is usually an expensive unit with high stats and or game-changing abilities like Fourth Tree Elder or Adaptive Predator, but it could be something like Crystalline Chalice as well. But playing bombs in a certain faction are no good if you don't have enough things to do in the early to mid game in order to get to your late game bombs. For me, I've given the aggro part of the bread theory more priority in Sealed, which means you want to make sure you have good playable units at each point of the power curve. So enough good 2-drops, enough good 3-drops, some 4-drops, and so on. Similar to draft, I personally like to have at least 6 playable 2-cost units, and more if I can get away with it. Usually at least 4 playable 3-cost units, and then once I get to the 4-cost stuff and beyond, the numbers will drop. I'll usually have 3 to 4 playable 4-cost units, 1 or 2 5-cost units, and the same for the 6-cost stuff. 7 and 8 drops I've tended to stay away from, unless it's something really powerful in the case of an Adaptive Predator, or it has decent stats but also has evasion, usually that evasion being flying. I've played stuff like Dormant Sentinel though, if the deck can support it. The other reason I stay away from 7+ cost stuff more often than not is because that's the point where you need to run more power, usually 19 sources of power, and sometimes even more depending on how many of those cards I'm playing. Anyway, my rank 18 finish in Sealed was based on making sure I have playable stuff at each point of the curve and prioritizing that over having a bunch of bombs and removal, and the result was just a solid Combre deck splashing Primal. I also did the same thing in the previous months where I finished in the top 200. The bread theory can work in Sealed, but because of the RNG nature of packs in Sealed, I find it works better in draft, and instead I just put more focus into having a good curve with playable cards. So the next thing I want to talk about, it's maybe kind of a hot topic, but I want to talk about whether or not you should start playing week 1 versus waiting until your pool is good enough. So I've done both, but for the past 4 months, I started playing sealed from week 1 and not waiting until I get more cards. In hearing what other players have been saying, it seems like people prefer waiting until their card pool is better before playing their leaderboard games. Typically, things start coming together week 3. At least that's been my experience. Either approach is fine. However, I think people need to realize that every player gets the same amount of cards each week. While some will get better cards than others, in my experience starting from week 1, people usually just have a bunch of piles of the best cards they could put together into a reasonable deck. I would typically see 3-faction and sometimes even 4-faction decks week 1. Occasionally you'll bump into the person that has a very focused 2-faction deck starting week 1, but that's often not the case. Usually others will be roughly on the same level as you in week 1 when it comes to their card pool's power level. For that reason, I would attempt to play starting week 1 if you have something even remotely reasonable. Again though, if your card pool is just pure trash and you can't at least build a decent deck, then by all means wait. You just need to be willing to jam all those leaderboard games you skipped out on in previous weeks, which can be a slog. And there's 40 leaderboard games in total if you want to rank as high as possible. Now, the other thing to keep in mind if you decide to wait, while your card pool does get stronger if you wait until a later week, typically so does everyone else's. So if you wait until week 4 to play, you'll have the best deck you can possibly play. And you have to assume you'll also be facing the best decks your opponents could possibly be playing. Again, I'm not saying everyone is on the exact same playing field. I just wanted to point out some of the disadvantages of waiting, and that starting for week 1 is usually better than people think. One last thing, if you're looking to play a leaderboard game starting week 1, I think the key is to look at the factions that have the most playables in them and working from there. So that goes back to what I mentioned at the end of the bread and butter talk earlier. Alright, so I want to talk about some other approaches I take to sealed, and this is stuff that usually happens in a given week. Someone asked a very good question back in December while I was holding a Q&A for Sealed League. They were wondering if I scrap my deck after playing the leaderboard games each week and reevaluate my pool based on what new cards I get. So first off, I want to say that when I open my packs each week, I try to make a mental note of what playable cards I open in each faction. What bombs do I have? What removal do I have? What good 2 or 3 or 4 drops do I have? How many of them do I have? And so on. And I think this is especially important week 1 because it helps you build the best deck possible for week 1. And it's much harder to evaluate what deck you should build if you don't even bother looking at your pool until week 3 or 4. The other thing this helps me with is keeping tabs on the good cards and the factions I don't end up playing at the beginning, which leads me to the next thing I do in a given month. If I have a pretty good deck, but I have a bad week where I go like 5-5 or worse, that's when I'll scrap my deck and start looking at the factions I wasn't playing to see if I can build something better in 2 different factions. If I do end up with a different deck that has potential, I'll use the tiebreaker games during that week to test the deck and see if it's good enough to play for the remainder of the chapter. During this whole process, I'll export the sealed deck I was playing to a notepad or Word document or something, scrap the deck, and try to build the new one. Most of the time, either I don't end up having enough playables to build the other deck, or it's actually just straight up worse than what I was playing, so I'll import the first deck back into sealed and hope to make it better next week. But I'll still keep an eye on that different deck, and so I'll export the new deck too and save that to the same document before importing the old one back in. 1 month, this did end up kind of working out where I had a perfectly good aggressive Huru deck, but I had a lot of powerful late game bombs to build a big Elysian mid-range deck. The problem was I didn't have enough early game cards in Elysian to stabilize and get to the mid to late game. But towards the end of the league, I finally got just enough early game time and primal cards to build it. And I played it and it turned out to be just as good, but I would say it wasn't better than the Huru deck I was already playing. All right, so one last thing I want to talk about are tiebreaker games. I will say that what I'm getting ready to talk about is simply based on my own personal experience and might not be 100% correct, so keep that in mind. The general consensus has been that tiebreaker games don't matter, and for the most part, this is true. However, there seem to be certain scenarios where tiebreaker games could end up actually mattering. Those being if you're near the top of the leaderboards and you just want to finish as high as possible or even go for rank 1. And if you're at a leaderboard rank that is close to a different tier of prizes you would get at the end of the month. So I'll try to explain this as best as I can, because I think the best example is probably around top 500, because if you finish top 500, you get a premium legendary card. So if you are close to dropping out of top 500, how many tiebreaker wins you have will matter somewhat if you have the same leaderboard record as those around your rank, and could determine whether you stay in top 500 to get that legendary or not. Likewise, if you're really close to top 500 and the players that are barely top 500 have the same record as you, tiebreaker wins could allow you to jump up enough spots to get in. My personal experience was in December when I dropped out of top 10 in the final week of Sealed. When I tried to get it back by doing tiebreakers, I managed to get 24 wins with about 6 games left to do, but I had only moved up a single rank. I then found out that the rank 10 Sealed player, who also had the same leaderboard record as me, had over 40 tiebreaker wins. So there was no way I could ever get back into the top 10. So the lesson I learned was to do my tiebreaker games in that scenario and don't just skip out on them. But again, I don't have concrete evidence aside from my own experience, but this is what makes the most sense to me. So if anyone has any different findings, feel free to share them in the comments below. But yeah, I just wanted to share my experience playing Sealed, as I feel like there's this negative attitude towards it. There's definitely some validity to it, since Sealed has more RNG than Draft does. The reason why is because Draft has become a more controlled environment now that the format has curated packs to draft from. So there are cards you'll never have to worry about seeing and playing around. Only a set amount of cards are going to be in the draft pool. Unlike Sealed, where nothing is curated, so you can pull anything within a given expansion from your card packs. In that way, Sealed kind of feels like the old draft format before curated packs were introduced. I think Sealed by nature just forces players to make lemonade out of lemons, if you will. And I've personally enjoyed the format because of that these past few months. But before ending the video, I want to mention 2 resources that helped me out as far as improving in Sealed and actually Draft as well. One is the Limited Resources podcast. And there's an episode where Marshall Sutcliffe and LSV talk about bluffing in the draft format in Magic the Gathering. Magic cards are used as examples, but I would still give the podcast a listen as it helped me quite a bit. My big takeaway from the podcast wasn't so much about getting better at bluffing, but it was about improving my technical play and just making more informed decisions. Specifically, what cards I value more or less versus what my opponent values. Trading cards for combat tricks, or trading units for combat tricks, etc. So risk versus reward, basically. I'm also going to plug an article done by Finkel in the Eternal community. So no, not John Finkel. It's on eternaltitans.com. And that article actually led me to the Limited Resources podcast I just mentioned. This was an excellent article, so if you want something with some actual Eternal examples, give that a read. But yeah, both will be linked in the video description. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video. As usual, if you like the video, feel free to leave a like as it helps me tremendously. Again, it's been a while since the last time I did an episode in this series, and kind of just YouTube in general. But if you want to check out the previous episodes, I'll have a link to that playlist on your screen. I also want to take a moment to plug my Twitch stream, as that's been my big focus the past several months. I know some people prefer to watch YouTube content over Twitch, but if you ever want to watch me play Eternal in real time while interacting with the community, I live stream Eternal at a minimum of 4 days a week. Up until this point, I've been doing it on Mondays, Thursdays, and Fridays, starting in the early afternoons, and then Saturday is a night stream for me, about starting around 6 p.m. Eastern time. The schedule is subject to change. I am seriously considering ramping up the schedule, but as far as the minimum of 4 days per week, that part of it's not going to change. But the Twitch stream is just a great way to interact with me, and you get to know me a little better personally. The stream just has a fun, relaxing atmosphere. I try to keep it that way anyway. And lastly, if you don't want to miss future content on the YouTube channel, consider subscribing to the channel. And I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all later. Take care.